Fake HOA cops dragged Big Shaq off his own porch. But what happens next flips the whole neighborhood upside down. One porch, one lie, and one name too big to erase. What started as a warning turned into a reckoning. Watch how Brookvale Heights tried to silence Big Shaq, only to watch him rebuild louder. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Brookvale Heights had the kind of beauty you could sell on postcards. Tree-lined streets, picture-perfect homes with manicured lawns, and neighbors who smiled just long enough to make you wonder if they meant it. From the outside, it was a neighborhood that promised safety, success, and everything the American dream ever tried to sell. But Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to anyone who knew his heart, wasn't the type to buy dreams based on curb appeal. He moved in a little over a year ago. After years of cameras, courtside noise, and spotlight heat, he craved something still. Something real. Retirement wasn't a retreat for him. It was a return. He'd found a corner lot with an old oak tree that stretched wide over the front porch like an open hand. The house was solid brick, quiet like it had secrets, but was willing to keep his. Every morning, Shaq made coffee in a mug too small for his fingers, stepped out barefoot, and sat on the wooden swing that faced the street. He didn't need much. The porch had space for thought, the breeze had stories, and the neighborhood had a rhythm he was still trying to catch. Kids would wave from bikes, and Shaq always waved back. Parents nodded politely but never lingered long. The mail carrier, a man named Brent who loved jazz and wore headphones no matter what, once told Shaq, "You're the biggest mystery this street ever got." Shaq just laughed. He liked being a mystery. Especially here, where everything was so scripted, so polished, but not everything was smooth. There were signs, small ones at first, a friendly reminder taped to his recycling bin, about proper placement, a note on his garage door asking him to tone down the music, even though he never played any past 8 p.m., and half the time it was just jazz. No name was ever signed, just HOA compliance team. Harmless maybe. Maybe just neighborhood stuff. But Shaq had lived long enough, had seen enough to know when a message wasn't about bins or noise. It was about presence, about ownership, about boundaries they didn't like being redrawn. He didn't bring it up with anyone. What was there to say? A few slips of paper didn't mean war. And besides, he had more important things to do, like running his quiet mentorship program for local boys who needed guidance. He never advertised it, just word of mouth. Every Wednesday a few teens from the next neighborhood over would show up after school. He'd talk to them about life, not basketball. Respect, discipline, how to navigate a world that doesn't always let you breathe. They listened, more than he expected, and he figured that was enough. He didn't need a stage. Still, something about the neighborhood always felt slightly off-center. Not hostile, just tight. The way conversations would trail off when he approached. The way lawn chairs always faced inward, never toward his house. The way no one ever asked him to any of the HOA cookouts, or wine and cheese evenings posted in the community bulletin board, near the walking trail. It wasn't rejection. It was erasure. Subtle, deliberate, dressed in smiles and have a good day. Shaq wasn't new to being the elephant in the room. But he had hoped, maybe just once, to be treated like a neighbor. Instead, he was the exception everyone pretended didn't exist. The man who didn't quite fit the tone of the block, as one email put it when he tried to host a small food drive. That email wasn't even sent to him. It was forwarded by someone who meant well, or thought they did. But he stayed, not out of defiance, out of belief that things could change, that maybe, if he just showed up long enough, the street would stop holding its breath around him. Then came the notice that wasn't a notice. It arrived in a sealed envelope, hand-delivered, no stamp, no official letterhead. Just a folded piece of printer paper, slipped into his mailbox. Please ensure your porch meets HOA standard visual guidelines. Unapproved furniture or structural changes may result in penalty. The porch, his swing. The small hand-painted sign by the step that read, "Be still," made by one of the boys he mentored. Shaq read the letter twice. He looked at his porch. Nothing was broken. Nothing loud. Just his space lived in. Loved. Real. But to them, maybe too real. Too personal. Too black. He folded the paper once, slowly, and placed it in a drawer inside. He didn't throw it away. He never did. He kept them all. That night he sat longer than usual on the porch. The breeze was warm, but there was no ease in it. A car passed slowly, then another, No one waved. Shaq's phone buzzed. A message from Malik, one of the boys he mentored. Mr. O, you ever feel like people see you, but not really? Shaq stared at that text for a long time, then typed back, every day. But we don't vanish. We stay. He put the phone down and looked at the porch light above him, flickering slightly, like it was thinking about going out. He'd replace the bulb in the morning. For now, it was enough to sit, to let them watch, let them wonder. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The one in front, tall with silver hair, buzzed too close to the scalp, stepped ahead like he was walking into his own yard. Afternoon, he said, eyes sweeping across the porch, not landing on Shaq until the second beat. We're with the HOA Enforcement Division. You the homeowner. Shaq stood up, broad frame casting a long shadow across the floorboards. Yeah, I'm the one paying the taxes here. Something wrong? The man didn't answer right away. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, theatrical more than useful, and scribbled something before looking back up. Just routine inspection, sir. We've had some concerns logged about property compliance. Minor issues. Nothing serious if handled. Shaq looked past them, down the drive, scanning for a vehicle. Nothing marked. No HOA car. No sign that these men came from anywhere. Official. Interesting. No one mentioned inspections this week. I keep a clean porch. Always have. The second man, younger, clean-shaven with a clipboard that looked more like a prop than a tool, stepped forward. You've got unapproved modifications on your front structure. Decorative items that don't meet neighborhood harmony guidelines. Shaq tilted his head. Harmony? The third one, silent until now. A thick-set man with tired eyes, nodded at the porch swing. This wasn't on the original property file. And that sign there, he pointed at Be Still, technically qualifies as expressive signage, which isn't permitted under subsection 12, Article 3. Shaq folded his arms. A swing? And a hand-painted sign from a teenager? Silver hair cleared his throat, tone firming like poured concrete. We're not here to debate, we're just informing you. You'll receive an official notice by mail. We suggest removing the items within 7 days to avoid escalation. Shaq leaned against the porch column, eyes steady. You got ID? Clipboard hesitated. We're subcontracted. Independent agents. HOA security protocol doesn't require visible identification unless requested in writing. Shaq almost smiled at the absurdity of it. So you're enforcement, with no names, no vehicle, no authority that holds up past this curb. Am I getting that right? None of them spoke. He stepped down a single stair not as a threat but as punctuation. Well, I've read the bylaws. I've paid the dues. And I've lived more life than you've got ink on that clipboard. So unless you've got real paperwork or someone official backing you up, you're gonna walk back down that driveway and not come up again without a better excuse. The silence thickened for a beat. Then silver hair scribbled again. Noted as non-compliant, he turned on his heel, the others falling in step like dogs on an invisible leash. No goodbyes. No thank yous. Just the sound of their shoes against brick, methodical and dry. Shaq watched them until they turned the corner. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. Something in their presence itched under the skin. Not fear, not even threat, but a cold precision. They hadn't come to talk. They had come to measure. Not the porch, not the swing, not the sign. Him. He stepped back up, picked up the mug he'd left cooling on the railing, and looked at the street. No one was watching. But he knew someone had been. The curtains in the windows. The angle of a wind chime that had stopped swinging the moment he spoke. Brookvale Heights had a way of speaking in whispers. Of using paper instead of punches. Of weaponizing policy, like barbed wire invisible to those it didn't trap. And today, the message was loud. You don't belong here. He took out his phone, opened the HOA email he kept bookmarked, and scanned recent messages. Nothing about inspections. No schedule, no staff directory, just announcements about landscaping tips and neighborhood mixers he was never invited to. There was a contact name at the bottom of the page. Langford. No title, just a name. Shaq clicked it. Drafted a message. Brief. Measured. To whom it may concern. I received an unexpected visit today from men claiming to be HOA enforcement. No identification. No notice. Please confirm their legitimacy and the nature of the complaint.
S. O'Neill.
He didn't expect a reply. Not soon. Not real. But paper trails had power. even in places where truth moved slower than gossip. That night, he sat on the porch again. The breeze was sharper than usual. He didn't bring the swing inside. He left the "Be Still" sign exactly where it was. Let them see it. Around 9 p.m., a motion sensor light flickered on across the street. A curtain shifted. He didn't wave. He thought about calling someone, his lawyer, maybe a friend. But what would he say? That 3 fake cops with clipboards tried to intimidate him with rules that sounded official but felt like fences. That someone in this neighborhood didn't like his presence enough to tend shadows instead of words. He wasn't new to this. Not this exact tactic, but this flavor of control. The way power tried to smile while tightening the rope. This wasn't about a porch. It wasn't even about rules. It was about audacity. He finished his coffee, left the mug outside, and stepped back inside, locking the door behind him with an extra turn of the latch. As he passed by the entry mirror, he caught his own reflection, calm, but alert. Something had shifted. Something unspoken but undeniable. The next morning, a folded piece of paper sat neatly on his welcome mat. No envelope. Just a single printed sheet. Subject: immediate action required. Your property remains out of compliance as of the time of previous inspection. Failure to comply within 72 hours may result in HOA intervention and citation. Refer to subsection 12(1) and 12(4) for enforcement guidelines. Still unsigned. He turned it over. Blank. No phone number. No signature. Just a printed threat dressed as protocol. Shaq walked back inside, slipped it into the drawer with the others. The pile was growing. He looked out the window, scanning the street. A jogger passed. A lawnmower started 3 houses down. A dog barked in a yard with 2 green grass. Everything looked normal, and maybe that was the most dangerous part. It was only the second time in a year he closed the curtains. He wasn't scared, but he knew now. This place had rules, and none of them were written for him. His porch had become more than just a seat in the sun. It was his observation deck, his sanctuary. Every swing of that old wood carried a rhythm, a memory, a sense of calm. But the calm wasn't natural today. It felt curated, like someone had turned down the volume on the neighborhood, just to make room for something louder. It started with static. He heard it faintly at first. Chatter on a radio frequency not meant to be public. Code words mixed with casual tones. Then he saw them. The same 3 men. Silver hair. Clipboard. Tired eyes. But this time, they weren't alone. A 4th man walked behind them, taller, stockier, and wearing mirrored sunglasses that reflected the entire block like an interrogation light. He didn't carry a clipboard. He didn't need one. His job wasn't to record. It was to watch. Shaq didn't move. He was seated, legs stretched out, coffee warm, body relaxed, but inside every muscle had gone alert. They came up the walkway like they owned it. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just slow enough to show they were in control. The man in front held a small device, something that looked like a scanner or a pager, and spoke into it before even greeting him. Subject remains in non-compliance. Visual confirmation of unapproved structure. Initiating step 2 response. Shaq's eyebrows drew tight. You want to explain that? Silver hair glanced up, but didn't stop walking. Final warning. You were informed last week. Compliance not met. Shaq stood now, not fast, but firm. This is my porch, my home. You're not law enforcement. You have no legal jurisdiction here. Unless you've got a signed order from the county, you're trespassing. Clipboard responded this time, voice cooler than before. You received documentation. The bylaws are clear. What you sent wasn't a notice. It was a scare tactic, Shaq said, voice even. And now you're back with reinforcements? For what? Some patio furniture and a wooden sign. Mirrored glasses finally spoke, his voice like gravel dragged across asphalt. This isn't up for discussion. Then, without warning, they moved. Not a shove. Not a strike. But a coordinated maneuver. The kind used by people who'd done it before. Silver hair and clipboard stepped forward, flanking him without touching. Tired eyes moved to block the door behind. Mirrored glasses spoke into his radio again. Subject is verbally resistant, proceeding with removal. Shaq didn't retreat. You lay a hand on me, and we're not talking about bylaws anymore. We're talking about rights. But they didn't grab him. Not exactly. Silver hair reached out, not to hit, but to guide. 2 fingers brushed his arm like they were nudging a shopping cart. The implication was worse than a shove. "You are being handled." Clipboard moved in tighter, boxing his path. They stepped together, forming a triangle around him, slowly shifting him backward. Not force, just pressure, silent, collective and undeniably rehearsed. Shaq's heels hit the edge of the porch step. Across the street, a door creaked open, just enough for someone to peek through. A curtain lifted in a second-floor window. No one said anything. No one intervened. He could feel it now. Not pain, not fear, but the weight of every eye choosing to look away. "You're out of line," he said, voice harder now. "We're within protocol," Silverhair replied. "If you disagree, file a complaint through the standard process."
"There's nothing standard about this," Shaq muttered.
Then came the final move. Mirrored Glasses stepped forward and simply said, "Off the porch, Mr. O'Neill." Shaq didn't move. For a moment, no one did. Then Silverhair gave a tiny nod. Clipboard and Tired Eyes stepped in closer, not touching, but crowding his space, body language shaped like a funnel. Mirrored Glasses lifted a black binder and held it in front of him. Inside was a photo. His porch, circled in red ink, or the swing, the planters, the sign, underneath a line of text. "Zone violation, Tier 3. "What does that mean?" Shaq asked. "It means," Clipboard said, "you're being escorted for administrative non-compliance. Your presence on a flagged structure constitutes refusal to adhere." Shaq almost laughed. "You made that up." They didn't answer. Then they stepped forward, and he had to step back, down the first stair. Then the second. Not dragged, not pulled, but removed. By presence. By silence. By the image of authority where none existed. By the time his heels hit the grass, the motion sensor light came on again across the street. A soft ding from a doorbell rang out nearby. Someone was recording. He could feel the lens in the air like a laser on his back. Mirrored Glasses lowered the binder and said nothing more. The three men turned, wordless, and walked back down the path. Silverhair spoke into the radio. "Step 2 completed. Subject removed." Shaq stood in the yard, the porch behind him, empty now. The swing creaked slightly in the wind. The sign still hung, untouched. But somehow it looked smaller. He watched them walk away, up the block, turning the corner until they disappeared. Still no vehicles. Still no names. He turned toward the house, took a step forward, and noticed something at his feet. A small yellow sticker had been affixed to the bottom stair. "Pending assessment. Property violation. Under review." It was dated that morning. Shaq pulled it off slowly, the adhesive fighting back as if the label had decided it belonged more than he did. He folded it in half, then again, then placed it in his back pocket. He walked back up the stairs, not fast, not slow, just steady. He sat back on the swing. The boards beneath him creaked again. A gust of wind knocked the "Be Still" sign just slightly off balance, and he reached out to straighten it. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're not the only one they've done this to. Stay strong." No name, no context. Just that. Shaq looked out at the street, at the homes with perfect hedges and locked fences. The neighborhood was quiet again. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that cost something. He stayed on that porch until the light above his head flickered twice, then went dark. He didn't replace the bulb, not that night. The morning after the incident, Shaq woke earlier than usual. The porch sat quiet, still wearing the stain of what had happened the day before. Nothing was broken, but something was changed. The wood felt colder underfoot, the swing creaked without wind, and the "Be Still" sign tilted just slightly to the left again. No longer a message, but a memory. His body ached, not from being touched but from being dismissed. There were no bruises on his skin, but a sharp outline had been carved into his dignity. He spent that day inside, laptop open, HOA documents pulled up, a pen tapping against a yellow legal pad that had once held notes for a youth workshop. Now it bore bullet points, questions, fragments of names. He needed answers, not the kind you ask neighbors in passing, the kind you dig out of buried systems that rely on no one asking anything at all. He started with the emails. Each notice he'd received came from the same address, notifications@brookvilleresidence.org. Nothing personalized, no phone number, no sender name, just the HOA seal at the bottom. And a formal sign-off. President, Brookville Heights HOA. He followed the rabbit hole through the HOA's website, navigating through cluttered links and outdated photos, It felt deliberately hard to use, designed to frustrate anyone trying to find real answers. Then he found it. A digital archive, buried in the board minutes section. Most files were months old. A few were labeled with dry titles like fence height adjustments and community safety lighting initiative. But one caught his eye. Special committee meeting. Emergency authorization. October 14. He clicked. The file opened into a scan of a handwritten memo. At the bottom was a signature: James R. Langford, President. Shaq blinked. He recognized the name. It had been listed on a contact email. But what stood out wasn't the content. It was the date. James Langford had died the previous year. Shaq searched again, this time stepping outside the HOA bubble and into public records. The obituary was easy to find. James R. Langford, aged 67, passed away due to complications from a heart condition. Survived by daughter Harper, a respected figure in civic leadership. Langford retired in his funeral had been held at a church just 20 minutes away. So how was he still signing documents? Shaq sat back, the screen's glow fading against the dim room. His instincts were screaming now. Someone was using a dead man's name to operate the HOA. Either someone forged the documents, or they were deliberately keeping his name alive, like a ghost propped up behind curtains, running the show from beyond. He printed the file and clipped it to the others he'd collected. Then he turned to the footage. He had security cameras installed around the porch. Nothing extravagant, just enough to monitor the front yard and driveway. But when he pulled up the video from the previous day, he found a black screen. Every timestamp between 1:46 p.m. and 2:35 p.m. was blank. Not corrupted, not frozen, just gone. The footage before and after played fine. Kids biking by, a UPS truck rolling past. But the moment those so-called enforcers arrived, nothing. He checked his backup server. Same gap. He checked the cloud archive. Still missing. The system hadn't crashed. It had been cut. He scrolled back further, to the first time they visited. Clipboard, silver hair, tired eyes. He found their arrival. But the audio cut out mid-sentence. Static replaced the conversation. The file ended abruptly. At the exact moment, Clipboard handed over the citation. Shaq leaned forward, staring at the silent screen. There it was again, that same sensation he had on the porch, presence without weight, power without title. Someone wasn't just watching him. They were managing the narrative, editing it, like a film director removing the scenes they didn't want the audience to see. He considered calling the police, just to test the waters. He dialed the non-emergency line and spoke to a dispatcher who sounded half asleep and fully indifferent. "I'm reporting possible impersonation of enforcement officers," Shaq said calmly. "I've been approached multiple times by individuals claiming HOA authority. They entered my property. There may be tampering with surveillance footage." There was a pause. "Do you have any video evidence?" the dispatcher asked. "It's been wiped. Or blocked." "I don't know yet." "Any physical damage? Were you assaulted?" "No. I wasn't hurt. But I was pressured off my own porch." Another pause. "That would be a civil matter, sir. If you believe HOA enforcement exceeded their scope, you can file a complaint through the county housing office. So you're not going to send anyone. Unless there's an active disturbance or physical threat, we don't intervene in neighborhood association disputes." Shaq hung up slowly. He wasn't surprised. But hearing it said out loud felt worse than he expected. He turned to his bookshelf, pulled out an old composition notebook, and began writing by hand. Not to document for court, to document for truth. It was something his mother taught him years ago. Write it all down. They can argue with your voice, but it's harder to erase the ink. Over the next few days, the neighborhood slipped deeper into curated silence. People still mowed lawns, kids still kicked soccer balls against garage doors. But no one met his eyes, not even the ones who used to. A man who used to wave during morning jogs now crossed the street early. The woman who ran the garden club ignored his greeting entirely, eyes fixed on her tulips as if they were giving her a speech worth memorizing. Even Brent, the mail carrier, kept his head down, earbuds in, barely pausing when he dropped off letters. When Shaq called out to him, there was a brief hesitation, just enough to confirm the truth before Brent walked on without looking back. Shaq started receiving more notices now, each printed on crisp white paper, folded tight, no envelope, no stamps, no official seals, just taped to his door or slipped under his mat. The language grew colder. Unresolved violations. Pending review by internal compliance team. Final phase before escalation. Still unsigned, still unverified. The final straw came when he received a parcel. A small box, plain, no return address. Inside was a roll of yellow tape, labeled "Caution, Private Property," and a note. If you don't wish to follow the rules, you should respect the boundary. Shaq stared at the box for a long time before sealing it again and placing it in a drawer with the rest. His house now had a file thicker than a legal case, but still no voice behind the threats. Just the ghost of Langford. Just the silence of neighbor. Just the sound of an entire street deciding to erase him. He knew what was happening. They weren't trying to scare him into leaving. They were trying to convince him he never belonged. That night, he walked the neighborhood. No agenda, no phone, just him and the streets he paid taxes for. He walked past homes that all looked the same. Not in architecture, but in expression. Every one of them had the same guarded glow behind the windows, the same perfectly placed planters, the same silence. He walked until he reached the community bulletin board. Near the walking trail, it hadn't changed. Same flyers, same announcements. Except one thing. A new flyer had been added to the bottom corner. Printed in grayscale. A list of upcoming HOA projects. At the top, Community Harmony and Visual Uniformity Initiative. Lead Acting President, H. Crest. Shaq froze. He didn't know the name, but it wasn't Langford. It was someone new. Someone real. Someone stepping into the space the ghost had left behind. He took a photo of the flyer, then turned back toward home. The streets were quiet. Still. Every door he passed whispered the same thing. You're not welcome. But now, there was something else in the air. Not hope. Not yet. But the smallest spark of possibility. A new name meant a new trail. And Shaq had never been the kind of man to stop at locked doors. Not when the house behind them stood on soil he earned. The name H. Crest stayed with Shaq longer than it should have. It echoed not because it meant anything yet, but because it stood out. It wasn't on any of the previous letters, notices, or emails. It wasn't associated with the old HOA website. And yet there it was, listed quietly on the corner of the bulletin board. A small flyer with an oversized shadow. Something about the font even felt staged, like someone wanted it to blend in but wasn't quite good at hiding their hand. Shaq took a photo, circled the name, and started digging. The first thing he discovered was that H. Crest wasn't the full story. The name stood for Harper Crest, listed as acting president in only one document. No other appearances in neighborhood correspondence. But the surname carried more weight than the role itself. Crest. He'd seen that before. A search through archived city planning records brought him to Langford Crest, former director of municipal development, retired over a decade ago, with multiple commendations, a dozen real estate ventures under his belt, and a reputation for revitalizing underserved areas. Shaq had seen the type before, the kind of man who called gentrification urban beautification, and told reporters he was empowering communities while quietly rewriting them off the map. The more Shaq read, the more the dots connected. Langford had once been considered for a mayoral run, but stepped away from public life after what was labeled a health crisis. Though Shaq couldn't find a single medical record, obituary, or retirement statement to match that narrative. Instead, what he found were whispers, articles pulled offline, lawsuits settled quietly, community groups dissolved after sudden property reassessment. Shaq printed everything he could find. Pages of PDFs, redacted legal complaints, corporate filings from at least 4 different HOA subsidiaries with shared P.O. boxes, and recycled legal advisors. The name Langford Crest didn't appear on any of them directly, but the fingerprints were there, always one layer removed. Always clean enough to vanish. It was a pattern. Langford didn't just run HOAs. He built them, set up empty shell organizations, filled them with placeholder officers, then used obscure zoning laws to reclaim property under the guise of neighborhood harmony. The victims were always the same: elderly homeowners behind on small fees, single parents without legal support, veterans living on fixed incomes, and more than anyone else, Black and brown families in transitioning neighborhoods. Brookvale Heights fit his pattern perfectly. An affluent pocket on the edge of urban sprawl. Increasingly diverse, but still controlled by invisible levers. The sudden enforcement tactics, the missing camera footage, the letters with no origin. It wasn't HOA behavior. It was tactical pressure, and Langford Crest had made a career out of perfecting it. But what struck Shaq most was the language Langford used when quoted. In one interview from 5 years ago, Langford smiled for the camera and said, "Our goal is to preserve the aesthetic values that made this country great in the first place." Another soundbite. Cohesion starts with architecture. If we can align structure, we can influence behavior. Shaq read those lines over and over, and they soured in his gut like poison masked as poetry. Langford didn't just control property. He controlled the narrative. He painted erasure as unity, exclusion as refinement. And now, even from behind layers of legal insulation, he was running Brookvale Heights like a quiet empire, and no one was talking about it. Not the press, not the residents, not even the county. Shaq leaned back in his chair, surrounded by paper, and asked the only question that mattered. Why him? Why his house? His porch? Then he found the answer. A city development proposal, recently submitted to the zoning board, showed plans for a luxury multi-use complex, retail, apartments, and office suites, mapped directly over the edge of Brookvale Heights. The proposed access road, it ran straight through his lot, and the 3 properties adjacent. Shaq checked the date on the document. It had been filed 2 months ago, the very month his first citation arrived. That wasn't coincidence. It was clearance. Langford wanted him gone, not personally, but strategically. And Shaq, by virtue of his home's placement and his refusal to fold, had become an obstacle. He wasn't being pushed out because he was different. He was being pushed out because he was in the way. Shaq stood and paced the room. His fingers itched to call someone. A lawyer, a reporter, anyone, but he knew better. This kind of thing didn't work in the courts right away. It worked in whispers. Langford's power was in the absence of evidence, the ability to make noise without leaving fingerprints. So Shaq changed tactics. He made a list. At the top, Langford Crest. Underneath, HOA shell companies, acting members, the P.O. box addresses. Then, development proposal timelines, zoning board meetings, and the names of every neighbor who'd recently had property assessments increased. And finally, Harper Crest. That was the thread. The one name that stood apart. Shaq didn't know who she was yet, but she was different from the other ghosts in Langford's machine. She'd made herself visible, even if only for a moment. He walked back to the bulletin board, late that evening. The flyer was still there. He snapped another photo just in case. Then he noticed something else. Taped beneath the main page was a smaller note, almost hidden behind a tack. It read, "All concerns regarding neighborhood fairness can be submitted anonymously to hcrest@brookvaleresidence.org." It wasn't much, but it was a crack. Shaq returned home, sat at his desk, and crafted an email. Subject, concern regarding recent events, to hcrest@brookvaleresidence.org. Miss Crest, I'm reaching out regarding recent actions taken by HOA representatives. My property has been subject to citations with no legal grounding, and I've experienced what I believe to be unauthorized surveillance interference. I understand you are serving in a leadership capacity, and may be new to this role. If so, you deserve to know that your name is being used to validate unethical practices rooted in silence and coercion. If you'd like to talk off the record, I'm available. Sess O'Neill. He didn't expect a reply. People under Langford's influence didn't speak freely, but Harper was a variable, a crack in the mirror, and Shaq had learned to watch for those. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 3rd morning, a brown envelope appeared at his door. No return address, no postage. Inside were copies of meeting minutes, ones that had never been published online, internal memos with initials, not names, a list of properties flagged for strategic acquisition. His house was 4th on the list. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. You're not imagining it. You're not alone. Don't stop. H.C. Shaq stood still, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He exhaled. Finally, someone inside the machine had blinked. Someone behind the curtain wasn't asleep. Langford Crest might still be running the show, but now there was a second player in the game. And this time Shaq wasn't just reacting. He was planning. The face behind the curtain had been revealed. But the story behind the face, that was just beginning. The envelope was resting neatly between the screen door and the frame, barely visible unless you were looking for it. No markings, no postage, just a single flat, manila envelope. Shaq noticed it as he reached for the door, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more than another routine morning. But the moment his fingers brushed the thick paper, his gut tensed. This wasn't another HOA warning or fabricated citation. It was heavier, literally and in feeling. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Part of him expected it to be a trap, a stunt, maybe even a cruel joke meant to draw him deeper into paranoia. But the other part, the part still burning from being walked off his own porch, from the blank faces of neighbors, from the useless response of law enforcement, knew this might be the only real thing that had landed on his doorstep in weeks. He opened it carefully, sliding the contents out like they were live wires. Inside were several sheets of paper, each with different formatting and logos. Some were internal memos from the HOA marked confidential, do not distribute. Others were blueprints, literal ones, highlighting routes of proposed infrastructure changes in the neighborhood. And there, tucked near the back, was a grainy black and white image clipped from a surveillance camera. One that clearly showed the moment mirrored glasses stepped onto Shaq's porch, binder in hand. But there had been no footage. Shaq had checked and rechecked. His cameras had gone dark. Yet here was a snapshot, proof that the feed hadn't just malfunctioned. It had been intercepted. Someone had saved a frame, copied a file, and slipped it back to him like a message in a bottle. At the bottom of the stack, a single post-it note was attached with looping, small handwriting. You're not alone. No name, no phone number, just those 3 words. Casual, almost gentle, but weighty enough to anchor his whole chest. He reread the phrase over and over, as if the repetition might make the rest of the mystery surface from between the lines. Who would risk sending this? Who had access to surveillance footage and internal memos? Who was trying to help? He spread the papers across the table like a puzzle. The HOA memos referenced upcoming compliance escalations and strategic review targets. One line stood out. Residents flagged in Tier 3 zones will be encouraged to vacate ahead of district zoning transition, especially those with non-compliant porch modifications or unapproved mentorship activity. Mentorship activity.
That was about him.
No question. He flipped to another page, a draft document from a real estate legal team, titled Expedited Property Reversion Process, with a list of addresses. His was there, not highlighted, not circled, just listed, like an item waiting to be checked off. Then he saw the internal email thread. 3 people, initials only, AC, JT, and HC. HC, Harper Crest. She hadn't replied to his email, but she was still watching. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the edges of the envelope still curling on the table. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just reacting to the HOA's next move, he was looking at their playbook, and someone from the inside had decided he deserved to see it. He scanned through the surveillance still again, noticing the timestamp in the corner, 14:02:17. That was the exact time his own camera feed had cut out, which meant whoever sent this had access to the raw feed, unfiltered by the system Langford's people had compromised. It also meant one more thing. Someone was actively recording the moments they claimed didn't exist. That detail stuck in his mind, more than the documents themselves. The HOA wasn't just hiding actions. They were editing history, and someone inside their circle was preserving truth, risking everything to do it. Shaq knew how these systems worked. Not because he was a lawyer or an activist, but because he'd lived long enough to know how institutions whispered their threats instead of screaming them. This wasn't about a sign on a porch, or a swing hanging too low. It was about control, the kind that operated in paperwork, and pixels, in silence and smiles. Langford Crest wasn't running an HOA. He was curating reality, and people like Shaq were liabilities to that vision. He organized the documents into categories: surveillance, zoning enforcement strategy, legal drafts. He placed the post-it note last. You're not alone, not proof, but something more powerful, permission to believe that all this resistance wasn't futile. That afternoon, he drove to a library 2 towns over, and used one of the public scanners to digitize everything. He saved it to an encrypted flash drive, then mailed a copy to a trusted friend out of state. Tariq Devlin, a former mentee turned investigative journalist, now working at a mid-tier outlet in Chicago. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but if there was one person who could make sense of this mess and shine a light under the rug, it was Tariq. He didn't include a long note, just a printed message on top of the files. I think I've found the story you were born to tell. By the time he returned home, the sun was falling behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the same porch that had been stolen from him. He sat there anyway, not in defiance this time, but in quiet reclamation. The swing moved slightly beneath him, its joints creaking like old bones telling new stories. He thought about Harper Crest, about what it meant for someone bearing Langford's name to push back against the very system her father had built. Maybe she wasn't trying to take him down. Maybe she was just trying not to become him. That night, Shaq didn't draw the curtains. He left the porch light on and placed the envelope on the step, like an invitation. The next morning, it was gone. In its place, a second note.
You're closer than you think. Trust that.
No signature. Still Harper. He believed. But now she was speaking with intent.
The day moved differently after that. The air didn't feel as heavy. The street didn't seem as closed off. Neighbors still didn't make eye contact. But now Shaq didn't need them to. The truth was shifting. The power was tilting, even if no one else could feel it yet. He was starting to. That evening, his phone buzzed. An email from Tariq. Subject: got it. You weren't kidding. This is deep. I'm flying out. Don't make a move until I land. We're going to do this the right way. TD. Shaq smiled tight, tired, but real. The game had changed. Langford Crest still had the system. But Shaq now had the story. And somewhere behind those HOA walls, Harper Crest had drawn her own line in the sand. No one had thrown a punch. No windows were broken. No shouts were exchanged in the streets. But war had started anyway. And for the first time since he'd stepped onto that porch, Shaq wasn't fighting alone. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. On courts, in boardrooms, behind closed doors, where decisions were made without speaking. But he hadn't seen this coming. The second envelope had vanished like smoke, replaced with a handwritten note, promising he was closer than he thought. And for the first time, he believed it. The night Tariq landed, they met in the back corner of a diner, just off the interstate. The kind of place that didn't ask questions and always smelled like burnt toast, no matter what time it was. Tariq had aged into his role as a truth digger. He still wore his cap low, and kept a tape recorder in his jacket pocket. His voice was calm, deliberate, but his eyes buzzed with electricity the moment he opened the folder. Shaq had handed over. This isn't just negligence, Tariq said. It's manufactured displacement. A network built to squeeze out the people who make places like Brookvale real. He looked up. You were the wedge, the one they couldn't easily move. So they tried to bend the rules around you. Shaq nodded, and someone inside cracked the door open. They pored over the documents page by page, piecing together the flow of deception like detectives in a silent crime scene. Tariq laid out a timeline of key events and cross-referenced public records with the internal HOA memos. One name popped again and again. H. Harper Crest. She had appeared subtly, only initials, only on internal planning notes or routed messages between departments. But she was always present when something critical moved forward. It was clear she wasn't just an admin. She was a gatekeeper. But now it seemed, she was also a saboteur. Langford has a daughter? Tariq asked. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed, brows tight in thought. That's the piece I couldn't figure. I saw her name on one zoning flyer weeks ago, but no photo, no details, just H. Crest. Now she's the ghost inside the machine. They decided to pull property records and employment databases. The next morning, Tariq had access to tools Shaq didn't: deep web portals, archives not available to public searches. Within hours, he had a full background file. Harper Elaine Crest, 32, no criminal history, background in urban planning, worked under her father's companies briefly, then disappeared from public life for 5 years, reappeared 18 months ago, quietly filed into a job as operations analyst, under one of Langford's shell HOAs, Brookvale included. Her resume was impressive. Her record clean, but the gap in her employment raised eyebrows. No professional activity, no photos, no social media footprint beyond a dusty LinkedIn page last updated 6 years ago. She ghosted the world after her dad's fall from grace, Tariq said, then comes back to work inside one of his machines. Something happened. That night, Shaq received a third note. This time it came taped under his mailbox lid. Meet me. No recordings, no names. I'll explain everything. One chance only. Midnight. Lot 7 behind Ridgeway Storage. Come alone. Shaq didn't hesitate. He left his phone at home, just as the note instructed, and drove in silence. The storage facility was tucked between a broken-down bowling alley and a patch of overgrown woods. Lot 7 sat under a flickering floodlight, half-burned and buzzing like it was trying to say something. She stepped out of the shadows like a question he hadn't learned how to ask. Mid-30s, maybe younger, with sharp eyes that spoke two languages at once, one of logic, one of regret. She wore no makeup, no expression, just jeans, a hoodie, and the kind of stillness that only comes from watching everything around you fall apart and still choosing to stand. "You're bigger in person," she said softly, her voice carrying through the empty lot. Shaq half smiled. "And you're the ghost behind my mail." She didn't smile back. Instead, she nodded once and said, "I need you to know I didn't do this for you." Not at first. He respected that honesty. Fair enough. Why now? Harper walked to a nearby bench, half sitting on the edge, eyes never leaving his. "Because I've spent the last 5 years pretending I was nothing like him, telling myself that I wasn't responsible for his mess. That distance was enough. But distance doesn't erase fingerprints. I worked under his name. I watched the houses go. I helped write some of the language they still use to justify it. And then I saw yours." Shaq sat across from her, hands folded. "What changed?" "You didn't leave," she said simply. "Everyone else always did. They packed up, took the buyout, took the fear. But you sat there, like the porch was part of your spine." She paused. "It made me hate myself." The wind stirred, sharp and cool against the still night. "I used to believe him," she went on. "Langford, my father, I thought he was building something clean. But he wasn't curating communities. He was replacing them, erasing people he didn't find compatible. He never used slurs, never raised his voice. But he had that kind of racism you can pour into policy, and no one questions it." Shaq's voice was low. "That's the kind that lasts." Harper nodded. "When he brought me into Brookvale, I knew what it was. A test run for a new model. Displacement by design, polished pressure, that first citation. They sent you. He drafted it himself. Said if he could make even Shaquille O'Neal bow to neighborhood standard, everyone else would fall in line." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I started collecting documents the moment I saw the list," she continued. "Your name was on it, highlighted, targeted. Not just for your porch, but for what you represented. A threat to uniformity, an infection of influence." His words, not mine. Shaq exhaled, measured and deep. "So why didn't you go public?" Harper looked away. "Because the system was built to protect him. Everything runs through shells, aliases, proxies. Even if I screamed, no one would hear it. But if I could find someone louder than him, someone they couldn't erase, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could burn it down from the inside." Shaq looked at her for a long time. "That's why you sent the first envelope." She nodded. "And the second. And the memo to your old mentee. I knew you'd bring someone who could take it to the outside." "You're risking everything," Shaq said. "I've already lost everything," she replied. "My name, my trust, my family. This is the only thing I have left worth doing." They sat in silence for a moment, the floodlight buzzing like a clock ticking between breaths. "What's next?" Shaq asked. Harper stood slowly. "I've got more files. Not just Brookvale, every neighborhood he's touched. I'll get them to Tariq. But once this goes public, he'll know it was me. He always knows. And he never forgets." Shaq stood too, his shadow casting long beside hers. "You ever think about leaving?" "I did," she admitted. "But I can't leave behind what I helped build. Not until I see it fall." He extended a hand. She hesitated, then shook it. A moment passed between them, quiet but thick with understanding. "You're not your father," he said. "No," she replied. "But I was his daughter long enough to see how power hides. And now I know where it sleeps." Shaq watched her disappear into the night, her steps fading into the dark like a line drawn and then erased. Back at home, he sat on his porch again, the air feeling less like pressure and more like presence. He looked at the swing, the sign, the wood beneath his feet. Everything was still there. But something invisible had shifted. He was no longer the only one pulling on the thread. And Langford Crest, the man behind the curtain, had just been betrayed by the one person he never thought would turn away. Shaq leaned back, letting the night hold him, and whispered just loud enough for the wind to carry. "Let's see what happens now." The documents Harper provided weren't just incriminating, they were explosive. Tariq Devlin knew it the moment he opened the second envelope. Page after page of internal memos, ghost signatures, targeted homeowner lists, rigged assessment reports, and financial trails that traced back to Langford Crest's corporate shell network. There were enough threads to weave a noose. They didn't rush it. Tariq insisted on building it right. No sensationalism, no clickbait, just truth, packaged in a way that would leave no room for doubt. He assembled a small production team, all of whom signed NDAs, and began constructing the exposé like a documentary with blood under its nails. Real footage, real names, real voices, but layered with restraint. This wasn't revenge. It was record-setting. A declaration of fact. Shaq watched the process unfold from the sidelines, not because he was unsure, but because he respected the work. He gave interviews only when necessary, offering insight with his usual composure. No dramatics, no speeches, just memory, descriptions of how it felt to have your dignity rearranged by silence, of being regulated out of existence, one policy at a time. The exposé launched on a Monday morning. Tariq titled it, Invisible Hands, How Suburbs Erase the Unwanted. The opening scene was quiet, drone footage of Brookvale Heights at sunrise, golden light spilling across rooftops too perfect to be real. Then it cut to Shaq, seated on his porch, telling the camera, "They never called me a problem, they just treated me like one." Within hours it spread. First in niche journalism circles, then on social media, then across national outlets. Comments exploded. Shares doubled every 20 minutes. Influencers stitched the footage. Attorneys reposted the data charts. And local politicians scrambled to issue statements before being asked why they hadn't known. By the end of the day, the city announced an independent investigation into Brookvale Heights HOA, and 2 others connected through shared board members. By the next morning, 5 people had resigned. By the third, Langford Crest himself released a public statement. It was carefully worded, teetering on plausible deniability. The complexity of neighborhood management often lends itself to misunderstandings, he said. My role has always been advisory, never authoritative. But the files said otherwise, and Harper's insider memo, signed by Langford with a private seal only accessible to upper board members, dismantled his facade entirely. Tariq included that detail in a follow-up segment. Just the signature. Just enough. It was a kind of justice that didn't knock loudly. It echoed. The media requests came non-stop, but Shaq declined all major interviews. He issued a single written statement, posted to his porch bulletin in clear black ink. This was never about me. It was about anyone who's ever been told they didn't belong without being given a reason. I won't leave the house I built, and I won't forget the porch they tried to take. Neighbors started to shift. At first it was small, a cautious nod from the woman who once looked through him on trash day, a wave from the teenager who always skated by with headphones in. Then came the apologies. A man named Ellis, who lived 3 houses down, and never once said hello, rang the bell and stood awkwardly on the step. I should have said something that day, he mumbled. When they came, I was watching. We all were. I just didn't know what to do. Shaq didn't let him finish. He stepped out, motioned toward the porch swing. Sit. Let's start now. It became a pattern. The porch became a confessional. People came to say sorry, to ask questions, to admit they didn't understand how bad it was until they saw it. The video had done what words couldn't. It stripped away comfort. It held up a mirror. Harper stayed quiet through it all. She vanished again, her role sealed in private. Tariq honored her request for anonymity in the credits. But Shaq knew she was watching. One day, another envelope appeared beneath his mat. No papers this time. Just a note. Thank you for holding the line. The porch still stands. He smiled and added it to the drawer. The same one that once held warnings and fake citations. Now it held history. The city called a town hall the following week. The room was packed, not just with Brookvale Heights residents but with people from surrounding neighborhoods who recognized themselves in the story. Elderly homeowners, displaced renters, community organizers with weathered clipboards and stories of their own. Shaq sat in the back, arms crossed, listening. Langford didn't show. But his lawyer did, a sleek man in a tighter suit than necessary, reciting rehearsed lines about oversight and restructuring. When questions opened to the public, the lines stretched past the back wall. People spoke not just of policy, but of patterns, of streetlights that never got fixed, of citations for lawn color, of neighborhood Facebook groups that quietly deleted any post about injustice. The voices rose, not in anger but in revelation. The truth had been in the walls all along. Now it was flooding the room. A week later, the Brookvale Heights HOA was suspended pending investigation. The board was dissolved. The bylaws were frozen under legal review, and Shaq's porch, once cited, once labeled non-compliant, was declared a protected landmark of cultural significance by the city's housing commission. They even offered to repaint it. Shaq declined. "Let the wood wear the years," he said. "That's how you remember what happened." He held a gathering that Saturday. Not a protest, not a party, just chairs on the lawn, food from local vendors. Music played low. Tariq flew back in. Kids ran through sprinklers. An older couple brought folding chairs and set up beside the porch without saying a word. Shaq stepped up just once to speak. No microphone. No speech. He pointed at the swing. This is just wood and nails. But what they tried to do here, that was deeper. They tried to say some people belong, and some don't. That where you sit depends on what you look like, how quiet you stay, and how much you're willing to shrink. He let that breathe. But this porch still stands. And it's gonna keep standing. For anyone who's ever been told to step off just because they were seen. The crowd didn't cheer. They nodded. Because this wasn't about victory. It was about reclaiming space. About dignity without fire, justice without fists. A reckoning not born of vengeance, but of vision. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, a child no older than 7 climbed onto the porch step and sat beside the sign that had once sparked so much chaos. "Beast, did you make that?" the kid asked. Shaq shook his head. "Someone I used to teach did." The boy smiled. "It's a good sign." Shaq looked out at the neighborhood. Still quiet, but now open in ways it hadn't been before. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The first nail Shaq hammered into the new porch didn't mark the beginning. It marked the after. After the investigations. After the interviews. After the charges against Langford Crest were announced by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Read aloud in the same measured tone that once protected him. The federal indictment named him not just as a financial manipulator, but as the orchestrator of a systemic scheme to reclaim property under fraudulent HOA practices across 3 counties. No more shadows. No more signatures without faces. Now it was official. He had a name and a number. Harper Crest never appeared in court. Her testimony came through sealed transcripts and anonymized recordings. Her voice was calm, direct, and when she described the inner workings of Langford's machine, the courtroom didn't need her face to see the truth. It was in her words, her confession, her refusal to hide the role she once played, and the risk she took to make it right. The Brookvale Heights HOA dissolved before the first trial date. Every bylaw was suspended, every policy frozen. The city stepped in, and for the first time, the phrase community management actually meant community. But by then, the neighborhood wasn't waiting for permission to heal. Shaq's porch had always been a stage, first for resistance, then for reckoning. Now it became something else. It started as a casual suggestion from a kid named Devin, who'd been coming by every Saturday since the documentary aired. He was 12, curious, and had a way of cutting through weighty topics with playful clarity. One morning, while watching Shaq pull up old floorboards from the weather-worn porch, he asked, "You gonna rebuild it for you or for everybody else this time?" Shaq had paused mid-swing of the hammer. He looked at the cracked paint, the split wood, and then at Devin's wide eyes, and without answering, he grabbed an extra pair of gloves from inside and handed them to the boy. That was the first crew. By the end of the week, there were 12 people on his lawn, neighbors who once stayed silent, now showing up with tools, paintbrushes, and extension cords. No one talked much about the past. They didn't have to. It was there in the gestures, in the way people asked permission now, before setting foot on the porch steps, in how they waited to be invited into a space that had once been theirs to police. The new porch took shape over 2 weekends. They kept the same dimensions but added wider stairs, a longer overhang, and an accessible ramp that wrapped around the side. They installed low, warm lights beneath the railing. Nothing glaring, just enough to keep the space visible at night, like a porch that never slept. Then came the idea. A woman named Carolyn, who'd once chaired the neighborhood book club, but never looked Shaq in the eye before all this, showed up one morning with a carving knife and a square plank of fresh pine. "I thought," she said, hesitant, "maybe people could write their names. Not everyone, just the ones who felt what you felt, the ones who stayed." Shaq took the plank and looked at it like he was holding something sacred. He nodded once. The next day they began carving, one by one. No ceremony, no sign-up list. Just a quiet procession of names etched into the under panels of the porch steps. Some were full names, some were initials. A few were messages. Still here. Not invisible. Watched. Now watching. Even neighbors who were never targeted joined in. Not out of guilt, but out of recognition. Of what had been missed. Of what had been allowed. Shaq carved last. He didn't write his name. Just one word. Rooted. When the work was done, the porch wasn't just rebuilt. It was transformed. It wasn't a front step anymore. It was a space. A symbol. Somewhere between a bench and a beacon. Kids came to do homework there. Elders came to sit during golden hour. On Sundays, someone brought a guitar. On Thursdays, a folding table appeared with flyers about tenant rights and housing resources. Shaq didn't orchestrate any of it. He just kept the porch open, let it happen. Reporters came. Not many. Just enough to ask if they could do a follow-up. Shaq gave the same answer every time. This isn't a story anymore. It's a place. One evening, just after dusk, Ellis, the same man who once stood trembling on the step with an apology he couldn't finish, came back. This time he carried a small wooden box. Inside were photos of his mother's house in another neighborhood. She'd been pushed out years ago, long before the cameras and the expose. She never got a porch back, Ellis said, voice tight. So I brought a piece of hers here. Shaq took the photo of the old porch, worn and uneven, and asked, "You want to carve her name?" Ellis shook his head. "I want you to." Shaq didn't ask why. He just took the knife, walked to the fourth step, and etched Marjorie Ellis in a clean, quiet line. When he stood, Ellis was crying. That night, as the wind moved through the oaks and the porch lights hummed low, Shaq sat alone, letting the weight of the moment settle, not as burden, as balance. Everything they had tried to erase had now been written in wood. The federal case against Langford Crest gained momentum. More whistleblowers stepped forward. Other HOAs across the state were being audited. What began as a single porch had turned into a spark across neighborhoods, long trained to accept erasure as policy. Harper never returned to Brookvale, but she sent a letter once, a real one, handwritten, no envelope tricks, just a folded page in the mail like it was supposed to be. I see the porch in every news story, in every headline, but mostly I see it when I sleep, not because of what was done to it, but because it still stands, and because you let others stand on it with you. Thank you for finishing what I was too scared to start.
H.
Shaq kept the letter inside, tucked under the base of the swing, not to hide it, but to let it rest where the weight used to sit. Years later, people would still come by. Some to take photos, some to leave small items, flowers, letters, drawings from children. The porch never turned anyone away, and it never looked exactly the same. That was the point. It kept growing, absorbing, responding. Because that's what healing looked like. Not a return to what was, but a construction of what should be. And Shaq? He never left. He just kept sitting, kept watching, kept swinging slowly back and forth, letting the breeze remind him that some things don't have to be loud to be strong. That's what the porch became. Not a monument. A memory that still breathes. If you've ever been told to stay in your place, this story is yours too. Because silence isn't safety, and every porch holds a truth someone tried to bury. Stick around. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint for what happens when one man refuses to vanish. And we're just getting started.